Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Hello, Michael. How are you doing?
Barry, I believe the expression is full of beans. I am well. I'm excited to talk about this. How are you?
You know, I overheard someone today. I loved it, and maybe I'm just going to copy this for the foreseeable future. Where I overheard someone passing by them, and actually in the cafeteria line, and they said, someone said to someone else, said, "Hey, how you doing?" And the response was, "Still alive."
You know, it's funny that you said that.
That's the best ever. That's the best ever. So how am I doing, Dr. Rapici? I'm still alive.
I heard the exact same thing today.
No joke.
I could not make this up. I was leaving my classroom, and there's a guy that teaches in there after me. I have no idea what he teaches. Seems like nice enough fellow. It's like, "Hey man, how are you?" He's like, "Not dead."
Not dead.
I said, "Okay."
Well, you know, that might be the fashion and that might become, in light of recent events, I'll just say that, in light of recent events, that might become a standard, way of addressing one's address. Might be.
We'll see. We'll see. It's new. It is a new day.
It's a new day. It's certainly a new day. We're going to talk about remediation, and this is part two.
Speaking of new, right?
Speaking of the new, we're going to talk about remediation. Let's do a little setup here. This is part 2 of 2, episode 2 of a discussion of the concept of remediation. And in order to talk about this concept, we went to the classic text. That's what we do here. Old wine and old bottles, but we do it. And we do it proudly at the Critical Media Studies podcast. So we're talking about really at 97, 98, something like that, late 90s text from David Bolter and David Grusin and J. Bolter. A classic text called Remediation. Last episode rather, we talked about, I guess we were just sort of talking through some issues that were raised in the introduction. And today for today's episode, we're going to talk about the bulky and theoretically dense, we mean this in a good way, the bulky and theoretically dense first chapter of the book, where they give a kind of theoretical, I think, and they interestingly draw on, let me sort of describe it a little bit. In order to talk about remediation, and we're going to talk about what remediation means and how that applies to media. In this particular chapter, something that's very impressive is that this is their theory. This is their theory chapter, right? They're kind of provides this sort of foundational theory for talking about remediation. They've already sort of hinted at the meaning of the concept. Mm-hmm. Now they're going to give it some historical grounding and some theoretical specificity. What's interesting about it is that they're poaching from other areas of theoretical endeavors. So in some parts of the discussion, when they're working through their concept of hyper-immediacy and hypermediation. Mm-hmm. And in some parts, they're invoking art criticism. And in fact, did you notice, Dr. Rapici, our old friend Jonathan Crary shows up in his day job before he was a media theorist, when he was, well, I guess he was always a media theorist in some way, but in particular, he was concerned about technologies. I guess before he was talking about digital media in the apocalyptic fashion that we've discussed. Crary is referenced as an art theorist, theory of technology kind of person. So, mm-hmm. So what's interesting, and I think is worth remarking about Bolter Grusin's remediation, we'll be talking about chapter 1 today. I guess the first thing to say is that they're bringing a cornucopia, a plethora, whatever, a copia, something, a lot of stuff, for a lot of different disciplines, theoretical discourses in a lot of different disciplines, to bear on the subject of new media, and particularly the way in which digital media is reconstellating and reformulating, refashioning the media universe. So there's a lot of art history. And I'm sure I'm going to bring this up at some point in the episode today. There's a lot of lit crit. There's a lot of lit theory, even. There's Derrida, and there's also even crusty old, I guess he was less crusty at that point, Harold Bloom.
Hmm.
So enough of that, but I think it's worth mentioning that they are kind of going all out. And this is a diverse, they're going into very diverse fields and trying to synthesize findings from um, basically art theory, multi-art, the humanities. It's kind of a humanities theory
But
of
it's
how,
it makes perfect sense though. I mean,
uh-huh.
because so Crary's talking about photography, right? And we're
Yeah,
talking
primarily
you're talking
photography.
about
Visual technologies is how
literature.
he calls it, right?
This is I think this
Technologies
is
of the
probably
agenda.
a good time to talk. Like, I think the central question of what we have to get to is,
Yeah,
what is remediation? How does it work?
sure.
And what does it look like when it works? And so, with that in mind, it makes sense that you would take or cast a fairly wide net to talk about a fairly wide variety of media.
In a sense, the widest variety of meanings there are, right?
Yeah.
The digital means an incorporation of all previous media.
Mhm.
That's one of the things it means, right?
Right.
Or it
So
allows for in its archive.
So let's use that as a starting point, right? If we're going to
Please.
cast a wide net, or they're going to cast this wide, expansive net, and say, "Hey, let's look at how media evolve, uh, and what that looks like." Let's just, I guess, start with maybe a recap of what is remediation. Then we can start talking about how we feel it works. This is, as they're using the term, remediation is the effect of let me see if I can it's the effect of older media in the development of new media. How older media
Yeah,
how older media
yeah.
shape
Mhm,
the development and the understanding of new media. And the
mhm.
idea behind it, right, is that there is no break. I mean, I think even this term challenges the common understanding of what something is when it's new, right?
Mhm,
Because the idea is I have this new thing. Oh, what is it? Well, it's unlike anything before. It's
mhm.
new. The concept of remediation really challenges that. The remediated version of new is, well, it is an offshoot or an outgrowth of what was before.
Right, right.
It is, and in that sense, it is shaped by heavily influenced because it is an evolutionary step as opposed to a break and a new start. You want to
Well,
add to that at all?
I do want to add to that, but building only primarily on the last, I think especially in your last sentence, you said the key thing. I think it's hard to actually define in a soundbite what remediation is, and I think you did a very good job of it. And I'm just going to add something to it because I think it's challenging. Because, and in fact, before I build on the sentence you just did, and I'll make a note that I remember your terms because you talked. I'm jotting down something here. Um, Let me talk about what remediation is not.
Okay.
As a way of sort of returning to what you just said about what remediation is. And and this is basically, I think, the purpose, the larger purpose of the Bolter Grusin book. They feel there is a conventional way of talking about the evolution or development of media that basically denies it's an evolution. So that I think one of the reasons they're coming up with this, I think it's a kind of complex term, really, or a complex process. The reasons why they're coming up with it is they feel there's a decided lack or weakness in media studies. And the weakness in media studies, at this time at least, and their book actually pushed the field. So I think this kind of thinking is less frequent. I think it occurs less often now. But at the time they were writing, I think they were pushing against a prejudice that said that the latest development in media always basically becomes the new victor in the media wars. That there's, in various valences, there was a story about media development that felt that had culminated in the digital, and therefore it's kind of the end of history. Media is over. The new thing is taken over. And so I mention this because I think your definition of remediation, in your terms, Michael, you are drawing attention to, you use words like in that last sentence I was alluding to a couple minutes ago, you use words like evolution or developments or interrelations. I think it's really complex or difficult to say, we were talking about this before we started taping. Taping, that's a remediation. We're not taping at all. But
You know,
anyway,
it's
uh,
funny. I was thinking about how many euphemisms we have for what it
exactly.
is and how we're doing things.
Yeah, exactly.
That
But
go ahead, go ahead.
but just to finish the thought, um you are using words. So remediation, it's a complex process. And I think the impetus behind the book is that people were thinking about this development, this evolution in kind of non-evolutionary ways. And what remediation means to Bolter and Grusin, I think it has everything to do with the way you were describing. You were describing a evolutionary development that's truly an evolutionary development, where the residual is co-present, or maybe this is a complex evolutionary development where you have the older species living in the new habitat set up and created by the new species, where you have these multi-layered evolution or so it's a complex evolution, but it's a development that's not a simple replacement. It's not so often in technological discourse, we talk about things being outmoded.
Mm,
And as I understand it, remediation insists on the permanent relationship of the old and new in any given media environment.
okay, I got no problem with that.
No problem with that. Let me read one sentence. I promise, because I want us to keep going. It's one sentence from Bolter and Grusin from page 47, if you're using my edition, which you probably are, because out there in Radioland, if you more remediation out there in Radioland, if because I think this is still the common edition of the book. Um, the very act of remediation, I mean, just
I have this
unpacking this
exact
sentence
same
tells you everything,
I
right?
have this exact same line
Yeah.
marked.
The very act of, it's everything you were talking about.
Yeah.
The very act of remediation, however, ensures that the older medium cannot entirely be effaced. I'll finish the sentence.
Hmm.
Semicolon. The new medium remains dependent on the older one in acknowledged or unacknowledged ways.
Right.
So that's it in a nutshell. This idea of the co-presence, the co-relation between the old and the new. That's what's being sort of emphasized in remediation.
It is, and I think that, as you're talking, one of the things that came to mind is that it's the way that the older iterations, or just say the older media, hang on is multiple. It's not that it's
Indeed,
just a
indeed,
single aspect of
indeed,
it that bleeds through.
indeed,
There are, I think, always multiple disparate connections
indeed, indeed. It's
because
a
these are not,
shifting terrain, constantly dynamic. That's a word we
yeah,
want, right?
because I
Dynamic terrain.
don't think that this evolution, if we're going to call it that or just use that as a term, I don't feel that I feel that the evolution is constant, but I don't necessarily feel that it's linear or consistent.
Indeed,
And I think that
indeed.
that's one of the things that makes this a little more difficult to
Yeah,
quickly wrap your head around,
yeah,
because there are going to be scant traces here, more obvious traces there.
yeah.
It's like if well, yeah, I think that's so. Maybe let's use that.
But as we leave, I just want to put just one little fillip there. I
Sure.
mean, you you know, I wanted to get back to like what we were doing in the pregame show, right?
Mhm.
We were like, well, we're going to have to define what this is, and even as we've done it, I'm once again conscious about it's really complex, actually, what they're talking about. It's a really because of the dynamic, because of the fact that there is no one size fits all. It's dynamic. There are these uneven developments like you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult to define.
It is. So maybe instead
Okay, I'll
of,
let you pivot. I didn't mean to pivot. I just wanted to sort. I was struck by that when in trying to answer the question, I realized how it's difficult. They make it difficult in a good way. They make it challenging.
well, I think that the idea behind remediation, I think, resists definition because it's such a big term that is applied. Like, what are we're talking about the the progress of media over time.
Of course.
And the other thing is that these media progressions are they're interwoven in a way that is entirely indifferent towards genre or medium, right? Like it's important to understand
Absolutely.
that what
It's
we
it's
see for
happening in between media, right?
it,
There's
it
both,
is, and
right? Right.
but I think that that's sort of, I don't know, I may make up a word here, right? Like that intermedia, those spaces between, that's where the good stuff happens.
Right.
Because when you start to see, film interact with music, interact with I don't know, give me something here, right? Art, um,
Books.
book, thank you. When you start to see the sort of the confluence of those various threads, the spaces between them do not react or interact at the same rate in the same ways at the same times. But that's the place where I think we become most aware that things are changing because that's the space. Like a you can have a book become a movie, right? That happens all the time. You can
Mhm.
have that movie then here. Here's this nice transition for you. That movie then becomes a video game, right? We talked about this with Spider-Man, right? Like you've got the comic becomes a series of movies, becomes a series of video games, becomes all sorts of other media creations. We can't really recognize something as new unless we have some sort of awareness that it existed in a previous instance, in a previous
Absolutely.
formation earlier. But then, if we're going to try and understand the cultural significance of something or what something means, you can't do that effectively
Mhm.
without looking into the spaces among
In
the
between the
various.
medias, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
that allows the different media to be interlocked, or that the interlocking of media is what allows one to position oneself as a spectator, right?
right.
That particular because part of the pleasure and maybe potential displeasure of the spectator is a spectator is using one media. This is one mode of remediation, but as you were saying, there are like several going on,
You
right?
can't chase
Uh,
down a single one, I
yeah,
don't
you
think.
can, but let's isolate one just to show the diversity of remediation. It strikes me is that, the classic, what everyone has an opinion on is like, if they read a book and they go see a movie,
Yes.
they're always having the classic discussion. So classic, it's beyond cliche and beyond stereotype is, um, well, I love the book, but I hated the movie, or vice versa. Or this was never a good book, but man, it's a fantastic movie. Okay, in a way, I mean, one easy takeaway, one easy positive thing one could say about Bolter Grusin is they allow you to understand that cliche conversation as an attempt by the spectator, by the audience member, right, by the viewer, An attempt to understand the relation between two different media, and therefore they're contemplating it's a way to contemplate remediation.
So let me ask you a question about this because you
Yes.
said a few things here that are really interesting. Um, you've referred so two things, and let me hit them both independently, and then I'm gonna pull them together into what may or may not be a question. But as I've said earlier, I'm terrible at asking questions, so we'll see
Silly,
if I can land this or not.
silly Dr. Remediation.
You had mentioned a couple times you used the term spectators, like we're media spectators.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I wonder, aren't we sort of media participants in this? Because the idea,
That's a great. Go ahead, please,
well,
please,
I think
please.
that when we think about these terms,
Mhm.
or we just no, that's a terrible word choice. When we think about these, I'm going to isolate them for a second. When we think about these media artifacts, okay,
Okay,
and
gotcha.
there is, I think, a temptation to look at them as isolated things.
Sure, sure, sure.
We interrogate them. We ascribe meaning to them. We use them as sort of little
Interpreted. Yeah.
cultural signs and moments that that we
Right,
use to tell
right,
our stories.
right.
And that is necessarily involving ourselves and our interpretation of those spaces between the media. Um, the other thing that I thought was really interesting, and I think so, this stems from a question that you and I were batting around before we sat down and started recording about whether or not old media is always exalted and I think that and you know whether or not that sort of exalting of media is maybe a part of the trace that comes over. And I think you just hit on it in this instant. Yes, I loved the movie, but the book was better, right? Um, I don't even know that there are any real cases where I mean that is the patented answer. It's like we are pre-programmed to privilege what came first in terms of its artistic quality. And we say, oh, well, that's interesting, but it's something totally different. Like, and you see
Well,
it with,
do you think we're pro? Yeah, I guess we are strongly programming that, especially, well, if you're like me and you're an English major, we're strongly programmed and predisposed I'm agreeing with you. Yeah, that
yeah,
we're
but and part of,
predisposed to say that books are this sort of exalted medium.
and I think that there's two ways of looking at this, right? Like,
Yes,
I
indeed.
think if you look at this as an academic thing, it
Mhm,
becomes an act of self-preservation, right? Because holy crap,
mhm.
what are you and I going to do if we lose the book, right? Like, we're going to have to reinvent ourselves in a way, and that's scary. But
Sure.
the second thing about it is also, it's like, I think that there's this sort of circular thing going on where when we look at the new media iterations, or what we're just
Right,
going to
right.
sort of coarsely call a new media
Yeah,
iteration,
sure.
an appreciation of what came before that
Hmm.
lends a sort of cultural cachet that elevates you
Right.
because it becomes a currency in a way. And the thing that I think about here is, and this is it's funny because a student today was wearing a Nirvana t-shirt. I was like, oh, that's funny. That that's old now, right? But I remember thinking when Nirvana became the massive force that they were, you had all these people saying, "Oh my God, sure, like Nevermind is amazing, but Bleach was really that was
Yeah,
great." You're like,
immediately,
kind of
immediately.
terrible. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not that
immediately.
there's this need to go back and to be able to reference deep cuts, to be able to know
Right,
more,
right.
and to and the fact that we can access those things that we have that we can spot. I guess maybe this is it. The ability to spot the traces of older media.
Becomes let's spin that out because that's a great observation. And I have a comment on your observation, but let me finish that your thought there, if I may, because I
No.
think I'm going to finish it in your spirit. Uh, the ability to trace out that pattern to identify that pattern you're talking about, gives the spectator, I'll use another word besides cultural cachet, but it means the same thing. Um, Cultural capital,
Yes.
gives you cultural capital. And that I would let me pivot from that to a remark. I said a couple, maybe at the beginning of the episode, or what feels like near the beginning of the episode, where I was saying that they're poaching a lot of different theories, including post-structuralism and French theory. But actually, Michael, you could write your remediation book on this particular dynamic, because one thing they don't really do is engage. I think in general, I don't think they give, they're on McLuhan's side more than in Raymond Williams' side, in
Yes.
that they don't give too much of a shout out to Marxist paradigms. And in particular, um, uh, Pierre Bourdieu's Marxist derived or inspired paradigm that says that, well, you can't have media is culture. So if media is culture, any move within media, including remediation moves, any move within media is going to be something that involves the spectator in a delicate process of searching for, opportunities to amass, accumulate cultural capital and disperse it and display their cultural capital. So that kind of, I mean, I think really what you were getting at in your comment is you are restoring the economic dimension of remediation. And I would say that, you can't do everything. This is not a major, I don't know if this is really a foundational criticism what they're doing, but I think that if we dig deeper, but certainly in these two chapters, I think the engagement with Marxism or even a Marxist thinker like Pierre Bourdieu is a little thinner,
Hmm.
you know. They are, like I said, maybe we're still thinking of 2 episodes back or an episode back where we're talking about Kemper and Zelinska, and they very helpfully um, sort of said, well, media studies at a certain point, it was on a McLuhan road, and then it went on the Raymond Williams road. And roughly speaking, McLuhan stood for a perspective that looked within media for the answer to the meaning of media. And there was a production mode of production, the mode of production, the mode of consumption, the mode of reception. Those were questions that mattered much more to the Marxist sociology of Raymond Williams. And I would say that Bolter and Grusin seem to be more in the McLuhan camp than in the Williams. As they're talking about remediation, they're more in the McLuhan camp than in the Williams camp.
Yeah, I think so, without too much hesitation, to be honest with you, because if you're in the McLuhan camp, you are much less concerned with the content.
Indeed, indeed.
It is much more the shape
What
of
am I
what's
doing with
happening.
it? And
And
what
I
am I doing with that content? What am
and
I
that
doing with that?
right. And if you can focus instead on the shape of the media, then I think that the associations or the connections among similar media forms become much more easily identified and grouped
Yeah, that's
together.
true.
But
That's
I
true.
think it's also a case that you start to reveal possible connections because you clear out so much noise.
Good point.
And so I think in that way, it becomes easier to trace possible intersections among seemingly disparate media forms, which would be very helpful. So yeah, I like that.
Well, Michael, on a different but not unrelated topic, there was one passage in this. We're mostly looking. I guess I should have mentioned this. We're talking about chapter one of the remediation book, but a lot of our commentary tonight, just for um, a lot of our commentary in this episode, just for the sake of compression, we're mostly focusing on kind of the coda of the first chapter,
Mhm.
which is called remediation, where they
Right.
give certain examples and they draw certain conclusions about remediation. There was one passage, mainly because it's sort of working through the remediation, the writers are working through the remediation process and really kind of bringing in literature, explicitly bringing in literature and literary criticism. I kind of wanted to read it and get your take on it because
Yeah.
I think that, and I don't feel I'm saying this simply because I'm an English person working in the English profession, but I thought that the invocation of lit crit, and in particular, Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence, is something I'm going. It was for me one of the big takeaways, one of the rich um, bits of this chapter that I know I'm going to take away with me because, well, let me read the passage and we'll talk about it. And I'll see if you think this passage is special, but I have reasons for thinking it is. All right. And it's interesting, and along the lines, this is part, the invocation of Bloom is preceded by a discussion of what they call refashioning. And refashioning is awful close to the dynamic we were discussing just a minute ago about the book, the adaptation of the book into a movie, right? It has to do with borrowing, right? Borrowing content or borrowing characters from one form and putting them in another form. So I'll read here. Another category of refashioning that they're going to shoehorn in that larger concept of remediation into it. Another category of refashioning must be mentioned here. I'm looking at 49.
Top 49. Yeah.
Another category of refashioning must be mentioned here. The refashioning that occurs within a single medium. Uh, Now, that doesn't sound very promising because one of the things we notice about remediation is that it
Across.
happens across medium.
Right.
But I think that by the end of the paragraph, they they suggest in a very interesting way in which refashioning that occurs within a medium might be also provide us a way of describing remediation. Another category of refashioning must be mentioned here. The refashioning that occurs within a single medium. And the examples are when, say, a movie alludes to another film, an earlier film, or a painting. And this happens, interestingly enough, they mention, and when you think about it, anyone more familiar with art history than I am probably can think of dozens of examples where
Yeah.
paintings or painters where the new painting is sort of made in the shadows and the margins, so to speak, of the older painting, or that image sometimes gets borrowed and moved over into the new context. Okay. This kind of borrowing is perhaps the most common because artists both know and depend most immediately on predecessors within their own medium. Okay. Now, like I said, refashioning is a internal medium dynamic. But then they move out to Harold Bloom, and I think that they suggest that there might be a way in which this refashioning dynamic may be relevant to remediation. So I'll continue reading. Refashioning within the medium is a special case of remediation. Interesting, Michael, I'm just remarking on this. It's interesting because I was talking about this. Well, refashioning is a remediation, but they went out. I've forgotten this. They said, well, it doesn't look like it, but it is. I was about
Hmm.
to make the case that this kind of is still remediation, but they kind of assumed that it is.
Well, I think I want you to finish with this because
Yeah.
I think I have something to say.
Okay. All right. Well, I will let me finish with that. Refashioning within the medium is a special case of remediation, and it proceeds. This is the part where perked up my ears. What Harold Bloom has called the anxiety of influence. Because, let me start again. Refashioning within the medium is a special case of remediation, and it proceeds from the same ambiguous motives of homage and rivalry. What Harold Bloom has called the anxiety of influence as do other remediations. Um, I'll stop there and let you make your comment. And I'm sure I can make my comment in your margins here. So let me let you
I
get to
think
it.
so. So one of the things that I'm seeing as we're talking about this idea of excuse me, of
Refashioning.
refashioning is the tension that they talk about between immediacy and hypermediacy,
Indeed.
right? And so um, the idea with immediacy, as Bolter and Grusin talk about it, is that the medium itself disappears. And I guess we could say, the degree to which immediacy is achieved is consistent with the degree to which we lose sight of the medium itself
And it becomes, so to speak, transparent
or authentic, right?
or authentic.
Okay.
Exactly.
Whereas hypermediacy is quite the opposite. It
Indeed.
seeks to draw attention to the medium itself as a means of creating a different mode of engagement. And they talk about
Wonderful
this.
point. Wonderful
They
point.
talk about this in terms of like a lot of digital art is going to call attention to the medium as a means of expressing a very McLuhan-y sort of thing here, right? Like the medium becomes part of
Indeed.
the message here, though that blurs the issue with content. So at any rate, if you think about this refashioning where we're referencing the old in the new, right? You have this sort of dual thing going on here where I think you can still be pursuing immediacy, but there's this little Easter egg in there,
In
which
there.
sort of
Right.
functions
Yes.
as a
Pointer to
hypermediacy.
a pointer to, yes, right,
And
right, right.
so
It's going
it's
both ways,
it's
right?
still very, I mean, this is a really cool idea though, because we're still very much like that tension between hypermediacy and immediacy has nothing to say about the success or the process of remediation other than to say that these are things that happen. These are aspects of remediation, right? So I think that when you look at refreshing, it's sort of like a chance to look in the mirror in a way and say, look, I am able to have this moment. This is my take on this. I'm not saying this is necessarily what they're doing. My take on this is that I'm able to pursue immediacy with a nod to the fact that there are other media in play. And it has to be in the same medium because otherwise you create an instant break where now whatever medium you're in becomes instantly available. But by
It's
keeping things in line, book within a book, painting within a painting, right? That I think that sort of repetition of the medium enables both to coexist.
That's wonderful. You took the passage into a place I wasn't thinking of, and it was such an, I'm so glad you did it, because I think what I love about what you said is the way you bring something we've been remiss in not discussing in this particular episode, which is kind of what the rest of the chapter is about, where they give you a fuller definition of hypermediacy, something we talked about in the last episode,
Hmm.
hypermediacy and oh, what was the other term? I'm forgetting it now.
Immediacy.
Mediacy, right. Yeah. So the ways in which they kind of give a historical narrative to the key terms that we discussed in the previous episode, and that they discuss in their introduction. And you're right. It's in play in interesting ways in this notion of, or their example of refashioning. Um, I only have one thing to add to that because I couldn't possibly do anything better. I'm just going to add something else that intrigues me about this particular passage, and it has to do with the specific reference and the specific reference. I'll start again there. Specific reference that they make to Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence. And I'll just give the briefest sort of takeaway or sound bites on Harold Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence. Um, and they give you the second part, the second important part there. So I'll just give you the first part. and then add what they say, and you'll get a very good handle, I think, of the basic ideas of Bloom's anxiety of influence. So Bloom's premise is that no one ever writes a new poem at this stage in the in and for actually for many centuries it's been to the point that no one ever writes a new poem. What they do is they write in the margins, they rearrange, they are somehow refashioning an older poem, a precursor, a model of some sort, so that there is no in now interestingly enough in Bloom there's never the possibility of the new. So in that sense it's not a remediation because he is insistent in his theory that so in one way, it's interesting. I think that in one respect, it's interesting that Bolter and Grusin go to Bloom because in a way, he's the ultimate anti-remediation theorist because he's saying his premise is no one could do anything new within a medium if they try. Now, maybe that's the caveat. He's
See,
only talking about poetry, right?
but
He's talking about,
I also still see that as consistent with what's happening here, quite
yeah,
frankly. And I don't,
yeah,
I mean, I'm going to say this and we can drop it because I don't think we want to create this epically
hmm,
long
yeah.
episode today. But it nothing new in the sense that the contents are the same,
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course.
but something different. And
Yes, indeed, indeed, indeed.
that's still
You're right.
consistent with
That's
remediation, I think. So I think he's actually
cool.
a perfect reference.
Okay. All right. Point taken and totally acknowledged because that's at dead on. But but I had to mention about that idea of no such thing as a new poem because that explains the second part of it, which they allude to. The second part of the formula of the anxiety of influence is because you can't do anything totally new, because you're always engaged with a precursor.
Hmm.
Uh, this is where Bloom gets psychoanalytic. You have basically a paternal relationship to your precursor.
Hmm.
And so he's a very strict Freudian as well. And within that Freudian model, you want to be your daddy, but you also want to replace your daddy. You want to
Hmm.
hurt your daddy. You want to, so there's always, and this is what Bolter and Grusin write in Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence, there is always the twin ambiguous, they say the same ambiguous motives. And I think the reason why it's ambiguous is that Bloom is following the psychoanalytic model, and these two things are together. Homage, so they're two separate things: homage, honor, rivalry. Now, in the psychoanalytic model, in the model that Bloom is articulating, taken from Freud, homage and rivalry,
Hand in
they're up
hand.
against each other, they're intertwined. Um, that's a fascinating way of, I think that offers a fascinating perspective on whatever one thinks even about Bloom's theory of the anxiety of influence. I think it's really interesting to think of the ways in which media could be to to ascribe a kind of intentional character to media itself and say that in the intertwining film and media, film and digital, cinema and digital
Okay.
sources, there might be something of some equivalent to the psychological drives of honor and rivalry. There might be that same kind of inner struggle, internal struggle, contradiction, or tension between those two poles.
And so if I'm following you then, that internal struggle, that connection, or those struggles and those connections would be the residual traces of the old in the new.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll end with a really, and get your response to a real basic example that everyone knows and that of course speaks to you and our hearts, right? But I think it speaks to everyone because I'm going to invoke the Marvel comic universe. And so I will close with a question that I think is in the spirit of what I'm talking about, right? And this idea of using Bloom in a Bolter Grusin way to think about the interaction between media forms within remediation. Is it possible that the entire aim of the Marvel movie is to kill off Stan Lee, to kill off the comic intertext? Now, you would say, well, it clearly doesn't happen.
But
But
that
still,
doesn't matter.
yeah, does it matter? Could is that really what it, can we
I
give
don't
psychoanalytic reading
I
to
don't
cinematic adaptations of Marvel Comics
I mean,
that,
you can do it.
yeah, well, I mean, that would be the psychoanalytic reading that that you are in the position, if you're making a Marvel Comics movie, if you're making the Avengers, you are so damn indebted to Stan Lee. You're so damn indebted to Marvel Comics that what you're trying to do, though, is absolutely replace them.
Well, I think there is always going to be a tension. There's going to be several tensions here. One, I think, and this is the homage and rivalry, right?
Yeah,
There
right.
is the tension in terms of homage to not change what it is,
Is
but there is the similar tension, different, but a tension since it's connected here to do better because you have to.
because
Because
you have to make your own market. You have to get your own audience, right?
well, no, I don't think it's so much about your own audience. I
Uh-huh.
think that the own audience is actually the audience is connected to the homage aspect of this. You have to the excuse me, that's terrible
Mhm.
enunciation to the homage aspect. I think the rivalry is to
Mhm.
say my new technological mediums require me to do better, to do different, to do
Right. I
newer.
see. I
And
see.
then the question of killing off, that it's tricky because it doesn't exist without that. But at the same time, if you look at any of these sort of, you know, epic sagas that are getting drawn out, Star Wars is doing the same thing as
Sure.
Marvel's
Sure.
doing, right? We're
Sure.
just telling more stories and we're digging deeper and deeper into these I guess canonical
Right.
sources, and that's where we've come full circle here in a way from where we started today, right? You're you have that social capital when you can understand and recognize the new
The new within
as
the
the
old.
the air quotes, right? As something that actually predates everything. I
Right.
think in those cases, what your that tension becomes very real because now you're bordering on creating something that is independent, in your example, of Stan Lee's original version, because he just
Original.
didn't write this,
He
perhaps.
didn't write it.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, the goal is to get there maybe so that you are free. But at the same time, you can't and you don't want to get fully away from that because if you did, then you have something that owes its origin to something else entirely.
I love it, Michael. And this would be my final comment. I love it because I love what you did with it and what you encouraged me to do. So I want to, I was dialing up the psychoanalytic and the very human drives and motivations. But I love your answer because you are kind of you're dialing down that. And I think that's the right thing to do. So, what if we think of homage and rivalry not as human principles? I'm going to go back on what I said.
Okay.
You kind of convinced me to go back on this and say, what if we think of rather than humanize the media? Your excellent examples make me think this. Now we need to scale back on Bloom, and then we need to think of homage and rivalry as the formal equivalent of a tension, a constitutive tension or contradiction that makes the new media artifact possible. That's what remediation is. So in other words, homage and rivalry, they're not the human, yeah, they're not the emotional outpouring. It's a formal effect of the fact that those two different tensions and drives
Mhm.
are there coexisting within the media artifact.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably the case in multiple other terms as well. I think, but yes, I think this is what we're really doing here, right? Is we're trying to put a name or names to the things that tie old and new. What is
And
it that,
new
yeah,
remediation, which is remediation.
yes,
So, golly, that almost sounds like a good place to stop.
I I concur, sir.
Well, what fun.
Barry, this was a, yeah, I genuinely enjoyed this conversation. This was we I mean, we went from um we ran all over the place and that's good.
MCU, the most important thing is that we have to write a check now to the MCU for invoking them in this episode.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, I'm sure they're fine. I'm sure they're fine.
you think they're
Um,
doing okay? Maybe
I think
not.
so. No, this was good. This was, what I like about conversations like this is that because of how incredibly broad they are, they're applicable to damn near anything. And so you can take this idea of, this sort of connectivity uh, inherent in this concept of remediation. And, I mean, media is such a big concept to begin with, but this idea that we pick up on and identify via these traces, I think is really, really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you think that this is not only helpful in media studies, but also in a way, this refashioning remediation idea could be used in multiple disciplines or multiple frames.
It's
I
possible.
think
I
it
mean, I'm
could.
certain
I think
it's
it
it's
could.
it's not hard to find situations where it won't work. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
but then again, I'm wrong all the time, so I'm gonna reserve my right to be wrong in the future.
I like it.
All right. Well, Barry, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. We'll pick this up again soon.
Take care.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.